Hey, what's going on? Justin back here, and this is my series on how to mix an acoustic song. All the plugins I used here were freeware. Go download the plugins. I've also included the session files and my presets too. So all that information's down below. The song's called Episode by Evan Mager. Check out his YouTube page and go check out his Bandcamp page as well. Yeah, I want to thank him for letting me use these files for this episode here. So before we start, before I kind of got into this mix, I had to kind of assess what I was given and find out where the good parts were, where the bad parts were, what I had to do, and also discuss with Evan, what his goals were and what he was trying to achieve with it. So the first couple of things is I guess you could call them the cons, were that he admitted it to me that he wasn't able to record it in the greatest situation, where he didn't have the equipment at the time to get a superb recording, and also the room that he was in when he was recording. So I knew that those were going to be a couple limitations that I had. But on the plus side, he had done a really good performance. So that's the most important thing, at least to me, is the performance. So those were some of the pluses. Then I also wanted to talk to him about what he was trying to achieve with the song, what he was looking for. And he kind of told me that he was looking for something that was, not too overly processed, something that was a little bit more true to the original sound, even though it wasn't ideal. And that's just because he didn't like the sound of things that were overly processed. He also didn't want too much reverb, so I had to keep those things in mind. And even though it looks like I did a lot of processing, it's a lot of really, really small things that I did to it. So the before and after, even though there is a difference, it's not like a huge dramatic difference, because if I was to give him something completely different than what he's used to hearing or what he wanted, then obviously he wouldn't like that, or he wouldn't be too happy with it. So my goal was to just take what he gave me, make the best out of it, and then just accentuate the good things, and then potentially take away the negative things that are maybe taking away from the performance, and just make it sound as good as I possibly could. So without further ado, let's start with the guitar. The first plugin I used was this 1968A preamplifier by Sir Elliott. So what I wanted to do with this preamplifier, I didn't want to do too much to the guitar, but this added a little bit of a texture, but it's very, very small. The before and after is not anything dramatic. I also pulled a little bit of the bottom end of the bass on this, but I used number 16 on the selector, but I think everything else is pretty much standard, the way the plugin comes. So we'll listen to a before and after, and we'll see what happens. Before and after is not a huge difference. You really have to listen carefully, but it takes a little bit of the edge off of the guitar, brings a little bit more bottom end into it. Very, very slight. If anything, it's like 2 to 5%. So let's get rid of that. The next thing I added was this dynamic equalizer. Now, I enabled 3 different sections here. You can have up to 4. And the first one I was knocking off around 370 hertz. The second one was 237, and the last one was about 4,400 hertz. And the ratio on the 337 was about 2-to-1. Second one's about 4-to-1, and the last one at 4,400 was about 2-to-1. So the reason why I used a smaller ratio on this 4,400 and the 370 is because those were kind of irritating frequencies that poked up every once in a while that I wanted to just pull back a little bit. This 370 is because there was some sort of clashing with the vocals in the guitar. Every time this 370 hertz, whatever popped up, I just pulled it back just a little bit, just to give space for the vocals. Also, this 4426 hertz or whatever, this frequency here, there was a little bit too much edge on the guitar again, so pull back a little bit more. So the first plugin pulled a little bit of edge off, this one pulls a little bit more, and then it kind of goes down the chain like that. So you don't have to necessarily do everything with one plugin. You can kind of do a little bit with one, a little bit with another one, and it all adds up in the grand scheme of things. Now with this frequency around 237, a ratio of 4 to 1, I compressed this one a little bit harder because there was some rumbly resonant frequency down there that I just didn't like, and it just wasn't sounding clean. So by pulling not a majority, but a bunch of this frequency out, it allowed the guitar to present more of the high frequencies and less of the lower frequencies, and it just gave a better sound to me anyways. So let's hear without it and then turn it on. So you can see this 237. This one's like, that's the actual sound, the peaks of the sound, and that's the threshold. So it's really doing a lot of work. These other two are just every so often as it passes the threshold, it pulls the frequency back. So I can solo each band and play each band for you at a time too. So we'll start with the 337. Okay, so onto the equalizer. So because the preamp added a little bit more bottom end, it also added a little bit more sub to it. So I just rolled off around 60 hertz or something like that, just to get that extreme real low end out of it. And also this is where the boxiness was in, around 600 to 800. I just had this twangy, honky sound to it that I didn't like at all. So I just decided to, pull that stuff out. And I could have used a dynamic equalizer, but I just thought that this equalizer sounded really good with what it was doing, so I just used it. So I'll do before and after. So you can see it brightens it up, brings out more of the high end. So, you don't always have to reach for an EQ to boost it. Sometimes you might want to. In this case, I just felt like it was a lot easier to correct the problems than it was to just take out an equalizer and boost the high end, because I wanted more high end in it, right? So that seemed to do the job. The last plugin I used was this compressor, this DC1A. I'm not actually using it as a compressor. I'm using it more as a limiter. Just so every so often, as those certain peaks past the threshold on the compressor, wherever I set the input, every so often as those peaks sort of get out of control, this thing just pops it back just a little bit. So it's just a little bit of a corrective limiting, I guess you could call it. It's not meant to do any heavy lifting. It's just a little bit, just a tiny bit, every so often as that guitar gets a little bit too dynamic. So we'll solo it and we'll turn it off and on and see what we get. Yeah, so that's it. So nothing too dramatic, just enough to keep it in place, I guess, and still retain as much of those transients and dynamics as we possibly can, because we're not trying to destroy the sound. We still want it to sound natural, as we can anyways. The only real effect I used on the guitar was this room here, the reverb. So again, he stated that he didn't want to use a lot of reverb, so I used more of a room as opposed to a hall. That way it could kind of widen out the guitar. I chose not to do any like doubling effects or anything like that on the guitar to make it really wide or whatever, because I don't know, it just something wrong with the phasing, and it just didn't sound right when, you know, I tried to widen it out. So I just decided, you know what, just go mono right up the middle. I can add a room that'll give it a sense of depth and, you know, width or whatever. And so that's what I did. So in this case, I used an old school reverb. I used a setting the warm hall, but what I did was I changed the timing of it. I might have changed the pre-delay as well, but I can't remember. A lot of these things I just do on the fly. I'm not, you know, taking notes as I do it. I just do it till I think it sounds good. So, but again, you have this setting, or if you want, you can copy it off of my screen, whatever works for you. So let's solo. So now I'll just solo the room without the guitar. Let's see what it sounds like. Now I'll play the guitar with it. I'll mute the reverb. So again, I'm still trying to put the listener's focus on the guitar in the center, and I'm not on the side. So I'm not boosting the reverb like crazy so it makes it ridiculously wide or whatever. So the focus still should be on the guitar and not on the reverb, but there's enough reverb there where it gives this big sense of space to it, and but it doesn't sound crazy wet, you know. And also I use an equalizer on here just to pull some of that bottom end out, because there was some honkiness to it. I'll play it with the guitar and then I'll solo, so I get rid of the guitar and just play the reverb, and you'll notice it a lot more. It does make a difference in the long run, but let's see with the guitar and the reverb at the same time. So you can notice right away, as soon as I turn that equalizer on, it just makes the center channel of that guitar pop out that much more, which is what I wanted, because I didn't want any of that rumbly bass tones kind of happening on the sides. So let's just solo the reverb and see what happens, and I'll show you what it sounds like with and without the equalizer. Yeah, so it just allows the actual guitar to carry all the weight in the bottom end, and then it just lets the reverb just add that space that I want, but doesn't add anything, you know, unpleasing near the bottom end. But yeah, so those are the settings. Like I said, everything's in the description for you to download the plugins and download all my presets. So if you want to try to copy the presets or come up with your own stuff, I suggest doing that. You know, we're all individuals. We all hear things differently, so I think you should do that. Or if you just want to load up my presets just to see what I did, play around with things a little bit, hear how they sound different. If you change the settings, you know, by all means, you can do that as well too. All right, so let's move on to the cello. So a similar setup as we use with the guitar. Start off with the preamp here from Sir Elliott. Boosted around 130 from the low mid section here. I also turned down the output, which is represented by the loudness here. Trying to get rid of some of the edginess in the cello and bring out some more of the bottom end. Let me see here. Let's solo this. All right, let's check it out. So a lot more beef added to that. Next, EQ. Trying to cut all that rumble in the bottom end that that the amplifier tended to add. Also cut out a little bit of the low mids here around 150. So, you know, we could have maybe turned down the bass knob on the Sir Elliott preamp, but sometimes you have to go with one plugin, you have to go a little bit further than maybe you want, and then use another plugin to kind of pull that back just a little bit, and that's exactly what I did in this case. So I'll do a before and after. Next, we got the dynamic EQ. In this case, I engaged two frequencies here, 350 hertz to get rid of some of that low mud, and also 2 kilohertz to get rid of some of the edginess and a little bit more of the edginess. We used the Sir Elliott preamp to warm it up a bit, get rid of the edginess, and again, we use this plugin to even take away a little bit more of that edginess. So in this case, though, the edginess is only removed once that sound crosses the threshold here. Exact same thing with the mud. So we'll listen to it before and after. So I used a ratio on both of them of about 2.5, 3 to 1. I didn't want it to compress it too much once it crossed the threshold, but enough that it did the job, I guess. So the final plugin in this chain here, which is the DC1A compressor, and same thing as the guitar. This is really only to cut off those peaks that kind of get out of hand. So you'll see this is barely doing anything, but I'll demo it for you. So yeah, it basically looks like it's not even doing anything, which it probably isn't at this point of the song, but in other parts of the song, when it gets a little bit more aggressive, a little bit louder, then it pulls it back, but not even a lot, like maybe a dB, maybe 2 at the absolute most. So let's move on to the effects for the cello. First thing I used was a flanger. Just give it a little bit more space, give it a little bit more depth so it's not so linear. It's moving around a little bit. Listen to it before and after. And I use the coarse 3 setting with this one. So next, I wanted to give it a lot of width to put it more outside the speakers on the left and the right and take away from the center channel. So I use this plugin called Wide by Terry West. Do a before and after. So yeah, you can hear how wide that made that sound. Next, an EQ. Take out again that low end there so that the center channel cello can take all that bottom information, and the side channels are more the mids to the high frequencies. And I also pulled out some of this mid range here. It sounded a little bit honky. Also, the vocals tend to live in this space, so it just made sense to kind of pull it out, give some more space for the cello and for the vocals. So I'll do it before and after. So it sounds pretty dramatic in this example, but once it's inside the mix, it definitely makes a lot more sense. Next, I use the compressor, the JS compressor. And the reason why I use this compressor, because again, I want the center channel to, do all the work as far as like the dynamics. So not only the low end, but I also want it to carry the weight as far as the dynamics are concerned. So I'm hitting these peaks. I'm compressing maybe 1 to 3 dBs off of it. Really fast attack, 2 milliseconds. Slow release, 1,000 milliseconds, and ratio about 5 to 1. So again, I'm not trying to kill the dynamics on this part, on the sides, but I'm just trying to keep them in check a little bit more than the center. Last, I use this ambience plugin. This is Reverb. So this stereo width cello part, or whatever you want to call it, it's basically going to end up acting as a reverb. So instead of it being just all wide and adding some thickness to the sound, it's actually going to act as a reverb. So so yeah, I use the Vic Cathedral 2 setting. I turned down the pre-delay, and I also turned down the damping so that there wasn't so much high-end frequencies in the reverb. And this is what it sounds like before and after. Alright, so now what I'll do is I'll play the cello by itself, and then I'll add in the reverb or stereo width or whatever you want to call it, and then we'll see the difference. So yeah, so that's pretty much it. So we'll move on to the vocals.